The plantation records show her name as Property Chapter 47, but the enslaved community called her Seraphina, a name whispered like prayer, like warning, like the rustle of autumn leaves before a storm. Born on October 13, 1799, beneath a blood-red moon that hung over Whitmore Plantation like God's own accusation, she emerged into this world with empty sockets where eyes should have been, yet she possessed a sight that pierced deeper than flesh, deeper than bone, straight into the marrow of souls. Dr. Josiah Whitmore, the plantation's physician and owner, documented her birth with clinical fascination in his leather-bound journal, the pages now yellowed and brittle with age. His handwriting, precise and calculating, betrays no emotion as he describes what he calls a fascinating specimen of human aberration. But the midwife, an elderly woman named Mama Conger, told a different story to those who would listen in the dim candlelight of the slave quarters. She claimed that when Seraphina took her first breath, every candle in the big house flickered, and the wind carried the sound of chains rattling, chains that had been buried beneath the plantation's foundation years before any living soul could remember. The peculiarity of Seraphina's condition became apparent within days of her birth. Though born without eyes, she never stumbled, never reached for objects that weren't there, never showed the disorientation one might expect from a blind infant. Instead, she would turn her head toward sounds before they were made, reach for people before they entered the room, and most unsettling of all, she would smile at empty corners where shadows gathered like congregations of the forgotten. Her mother, a woman named Grace, whose own story had been carved into silence by the brutalities of bondage, watched her daughter with a mixture of wonder and terror. Grace had learned long ago that anything unusual, anything that deviated from the master's expectations of normalcy, was dangerous. Different meant disposable. Different meant death. Yet Seraphina was undeniably different, and Grace found herself caught between protecting her child and protecting herself from the growing whispers that followed wherever her daughter went. By age 3, Seraphina's abilities had begun to manifest in ways that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. She would speak to people who weren't there, carrying on full conversations with invisible companions who seemed to respond in ways only she could perceive. The other children in the slave quarters learned quickly to avoid playing near her when she was talking to the air people, as they called them. There was something in the way the temperature would drop during these conversations, something in the way dogs would whimper and slink away, that warned of forces beyond their understanding. The first documented incident that brought Seraphina to Dr. Whitmore's direct attention occurred on a sweltering July morning when she was 4 years old. The overseer, a cruel man named Bartholomew Kane, who took pleasure in the suffering of others, had been preparing to punish a young boy named Samuel for allegedly stealing apples from the orchard. As Kane raised his whip, Seraphina appeared at the edge of the gathering crowd, her eyeless face turned directly toward the overseer with an expression of such knowing, such ancient judgment, that several witnesses later claimed they felt their souls being weighed and found wanting. "Mr. Kane," she said in her small, clear voice that somehow carried across the entire yard despite its gentleness, "they want you to stop now." Kane, startled by the interruption and unnerved by the child's unseeing gaze that seemed to see everything, demanded to know who they were. Seraphina tilted her head as if listening to whispers only she could hear, and when she spoke again, her voice carried names that made the blood drain from the faces of everyone present, names of enslaved people who had died on the plantation over the past decade, people whose deaths had been covered up, whose bodies had been buried in unmarked graves in the woods beyond the tobacco fields. "Marcus says you remember his hands," Seraphina continued, her voice maintaining that same gentle cadence even as the words fell like hammer blows. how you broke them when he tried to shield his daughter. And Ruth, she shows me the rope burns around her neck, how you told Master she died of fever, when everyone knows what really happened in the barn that night. And little Moses, he was only 7 when you—" The whip cracked, not toward Samuel as originally intended, but toward Seraphina herself. Yet somehow, impossibly, the leather thong stopped mid-air, 3 inches from her face, as if it had struck an invisible barrier. For a moment that stretched into eternity, everyone present watched as the whip hung suspended, trembling, before falling harmlessly to the ground. Cain's face had gone the color of ash, and when he tried to retrieve his whip, his hands shook so violently that he couldn't maintain his grip. The assembled slaves, who had expected to witness another brutal punishment, instead found themselves watching their tormentor reduced to a quivering mass of terror by a 4-year-old girl who couldn't see but somehow saw everything. From that day forward, Dr. Whitmore began conducting regular examinations of Seraphina, documenting her abilities with the methodical precision of a natural philosopher attempting to catalog a new species. His journals from this period, discovered in the plantation's archives over 2 centuries later, reveal a man torn between scientific fascination and growing dread. He describes experiments where he would hide objects around his study and ask Seraphina to find them, which she did with unerring accuracy. He documents sessions where she would describe in perfect detail the contents of sealed letters, the faces of people in portraits she had never been shown, the history of objects she had never encountered, but it was her ability to communicate with the dead that truly terrified him. During one particularly detailed session, Seraphina began describing his late wife, Margaret, who had died 3 years earlier in what Whitmore had publicly claimed was a riding accident. Through Seraphina's voice, Margaret spoke of betrayal, of poison slipped into evening tea, of watching her husband's face as the life drained from her body. She spoke of the love letters hidden beneath the floorboards in his study, correspondence with his brother's wife that revealed motives for murder that went far deeper than inheritance or simple greed. Whitmore's handwriting becomes increasingly erratic in the journal entries that follow this revelation. He begins to speak of Seraphina, not as a curiosity to be studied, but as a threat to be contained. He writes of consulting with ministers, of researching methods of exorcism, of correspondence with colleagues in other states who claim to have encountered similar cases. But beneath his growing desperation, there's a terrible fascination that he can't seem to abandon, the fascination of a man who has spent his life inflicting suffering on others and has suddenly encountered something that might be capable of inflicting suffering on him, the other enslaved. People on the plantation had their own relationship with Seraphina, one that existed in the spaces between fear and reverence. The elderly woman known as Mama Conjure, who had delivered hundreds of babies over her decades of bondage, took a particular interest in the child. She began teaching Seraphina the old ways, how to listen to the wind for messages from those who had passed on, how to read the patterns of bird flight and the behavior of animals, how to distinguish between spirits who sought justice and those who simply sought rest. Under Mama Conjure's guidance, Seraphina learned that her gift came with responsibilities. The dead who spoke to her were not random phantoms seeking to frighten the living. They were souls with unfinished business. People who had died with stories untold and wrongs unaddressed. Many of them had been enslaved themselves, people who had suffered and died in anonymity, whose names had been erased from official records, but whose memories lived on in the spaces between worlds. As Seraphina grew older, her abilities continued to develop in ways that defied easy categorization. She could predict which crops would fail before the first signs of blight appeared, could sense when someone was planning an escape attempt days before they took action, could identify who among the house slaves was passing information to the master, and who could be trusted with secrets that meant the difference between life and death. But perhaps most disturbing of all, She began to demonstrate an ability to influence the physical world in ways that suggested her connection to the spirit realm went beyond simple communication. Objects would move in her presence without any visible cause. Candles would light themselves when she entered a room, and people who meant harm to others would find themselves inexplicably compelled to confess their intentions before they could act upon them. The incident that would ultimately seal her fate occurred on a cold December evening in 1805, when Serafina was 6 years old. Dr. Whitmore had invited several colleagues from other plantations to observe what he termed his most fascinating case study. The men gathered in his study, a room lined with medical texts and specimen jars, their faces flushed with brandy and anticipation as they waited to witness the supernatural abilities of the eyeless slave child. Serafina was brought before them like an exhibit, her small hands folded in her lap as she sat in a chair that dwarfed her tiny frame. The men peppered her with questions, demanded demonstrations, treated her as if she were some exotic animal trained to perform tricks for their amusement. Through it all, she remained silent, her empty sockets turned toward each man in turn, as if she were studying them with eyes they couldn't see. Finally, Dr. Whitmore grew impatient with her lack of response. He demanded that she demonstrate her abilities by communicating with the spirit of his late wife, the same wife whose ghost had revealed his role in her murder during their private sessions. Perhaps he believed that the presence of witnesses would somehow protect him, or perhaps his scientific curiosity had overcome his fear. Whatever his motivation, he insisted that Serafina summon Margaret's spirit for the entertainment of his guests. What happened next was recorded by 3 separate witnesses, men whose accounts corroborate each other despite the impossible nature of what they claimed to observe. Serafina slowly raised her head, and though her eye sockets remained empty, every man in the room later swore that they felt her gaze upon them like ice water in their veins. The temperature in the study began to drop precipitously, their breath becoming visible in clouds that hung in the suddenly still air. Then the voices began, not just Margaret's voice, speaking through Serafina with words of accusation and revelation, but other voices as well, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, all speaking simultaneously in a chorus of the wronged and the forgotten. They spoke in languages some of the men recognized: English, French, various African dialects, and in languages that seemed older than memory, syllables that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. The voices told stories of rape and murder, of children sold away from their mothers, of men and women worked literally to death in fields that had enriched their killers. They spoke of bodies thrown into unmarked graves, of records altered to hide atrocities, of a system of cruelty so vast and systematic that it had created its own geography of suffering that existed parallel to the physical world. As the voices grew louder, objects throughout the study began to move. Books flew from their shelves, medical instruments clattered to the floor, and the specimens in Dr. Whitmore's collection jars began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. The men tried to flee but found themselves unable to move, held in place by invisible forces that seemed to emanate from the small girl at the center of the supernatural storm. The climax came when Margaret's voice rose above all the others, speaking directly to her murderous husband with a clarity that cut through the supernatural cacophony like a blade through silk. She detailed not only his crime against her, but crimes he had committed against dozens of others: enslaved women he had abused and killed, male slaves he had tortured for his own perverse pleasure, children he had sold to brothels in distant cities to satisfy debts and desires that his legitimate wealth couldn't cover. But Margaret's accusations extended beyond her husband to include his guests as well. One by one, she named their crimes, revealed their secrets, exposed the network of cruelty and corruption that connected them all. As each man's particular sins were laid bare, he would collapse to the floor, writhing in agony as if invisible hands were inflicting upon him every hurt he had ever caused another. When the supernatural assault finally ended, when the voices faded and the objects settled back into stillness, 3 of the 5 men in the room were dead. They bore no visible wounds, no signs of violence, but their faces were frozen in expressions of such terror and remorse that those who found them later would be haunted by the sight for the rest of their lives. The 2 survivors, including Dr. Whitmore himself, emerged from the study as changed men, broken, aged decades in the span of hours, their hair gone white and their hands trembling with perpetual palsy. Within days of the incident, arrangements were made to sell Serafina to a plantation in the deeper South, far from Virginia and the growing whispers about the eyeless girl who could speak to the dead. Dr. Whitmore claimed that she had become unmanageable, though those who had witnessed her supernatural abilities knew that the truth was far more complex and terrifying. The night before she was to be transported, Serafina escaped. How a 6-year-old girl, blind and unfamiliar with the surrounding territory, managed to slip away from a heavily guarded plantation remains a mystery that has puzzled historians and paranormal researchers for over 2 centuries. The search parties found no trace of her, no footprints, no signs of which direction she might have traveled. It was as if she had simply vanished into the Virginia night like smoke dispersing on the wind. But the stories didn't end with her disappearance. Over the following decades, reports began to surface from across the South of encounters with a young girl who matched Serafina's description, eyeless but seeing, appearing at moments of crisis to deliver messages from the dead or to intervene when injustice was about to triumph over the innocent. She was spotted at slave auctions, where her presence would cause violent men to suddenly confess their crimes and release their human chattel. She appeared at the bedsides of dying slaves, offering comfort and carrying final messages to loved ones who might never otherwise know what had become of the departed. Some claimed she aged naturally, growing from a child into a young woman over the passing years. Others insisted that she remained forever 6 years old, preserved by supernatural forces at the moment of her greatest power. Still others believed that Serafina was not a single individual at all, but rather a mantle that passed from one gifted person to another, a role taken up by those who possessed the ability to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Civil War brought with it new reports of Serafina's interventions. Union soldiers spoke of a young woman without eyes who would appear on battlefields, walking among the wounded and dying with messages of comfort and hope. Confederate deserters told stories of the same figure appearing to them in moments of moral crisis, compelling them to abandon causes they knew in their hearts to be wrong. Freed slaves carried tales of her presence during the most dangerous moments of their escapes, when her guidance had meant the difference between freedom and recapture, between life and death. Dr. Whitmore himself survived until 1847, living the final decades of his life as a broken man haunted by memories of what he had witnessed in his study that December night. His later journals, discovered sealed in a trunk in his estate's attic, reveal a man consumed by guilt and terror, convinced that Serafina and the spirits she commanded were watching him, waiting for the moment when his own sins would demand their final accounting. His last entry, dated 3 days before his death, consists of a single sentence repeated dozens of times in increasingly shaky handwriting. "She is coming for me, and I cannot hide from eyes that see everything." The plantation where Serafina was born continued to operate until the end of the Civil War, but those who worked there reported strange phenomena that persisted long after her disappearance. Enslaved people spoke of hearing children's laughter coming from empty rooms, of finding small handprints in the dust that appeared overnight and vanished by morning. Overseers and house slaves alike reported dreams where they were visited by a girl without eyes, who knew their names, their histories, their deepest secrets and fears. Modern paranormal investigators who have visited the site of the former Whitmore plantation claim that these phenomena continue to this day. Electronic equipment malfunctions without explanation, temperatures drop suddenly in specific locations, and visitors report feeling watched by invisible eyes that seem to look directly into their souls. Most disturbing of all are the accounts of people who claim to have encountered Serafina herself, still appearing as she did in life, a small girl without eyes who speaks with the voices of generations of the dead. The historical record provides tantalizing glimpses into the truth behind the legend. But like all stories that bridge the gap between the documented and the supernatural, Serafina's tale exists in the spaces between fact and folklore, between memory and myth. What remains undeniable is the impact of her story on those who encountered it, the way it challenged assumptions about the nature of sight and blindness, about the relationship between the living and the dead, about justice and its ability to transcend the boundaries of mortality itself. Perhaps most significantly, Serafina's story serves as a reminder that the victims of history's greatest cruelties are never truly silenced, never completely erased. Their voices may be driven underground, their names may be struck from official records, their graves may be left unmarked and their stories untold. But according to those who believe in the power of supernatural justice, these silenced voices gather in the spaces between worlds, waiting for someone with the gift to hear them, someone with the courage to speak their truths. Someone like a girl born without eyes who claimed she could see ghosts clearly. In the end, whether Serafina was a real person whose abilities defied natural explanation, or simply a powerful symbol created by people who needed to believe that justice could transcend death itself, her story continues to resonate with those who seek to understand the complicated relationship between cruelty and consequence, between oppression and resistance, between the seen and the unseen forces that shape our world. The girl who was born with no eyes but claimed she could see ghosts clearly remains a haunting reminder that some truths are too powerful to be buried, some voices too important to be silenced, and some forms of sight too profound to require physical eyes. In a world where so much suffering occurs in darkness, perhaps the most terrifying and hopeful possibility of all is that someone, somewhere, is always watching, and that the dead never forget, and never forgive and never truly die. Word count 4,500, but no body came up from the water. Charles Dixon, a blacksmith's helper, loud and eager, was last. 3 weeks after marrying Margaret, he disappeared with no word, his tools left behind. The sheriff, Jasper Bannon, pieced together notes and witness statements into an old, battered file. On June 4th at 2:17 p.m. he wrote, "Found Johnson boy's boot buried deep in her garden. Rope burns on ankles. Body cut below the waist. Evidence suggests deliberate castration." He circled castration 3 times, then locked the folder beneath a pile of unimportant paperwork. The record stayed out of sight, but horror moved underground. Dr. Elias Broke arrived in Dry Creek just before Edward Long vanished. War had left Elias with a limp and hands that shook when idle, but not when working. He spoke plainly and with care. A wound left alone breeds poison. The people trusted him for explanations offered in simple words. Poverty and hardship didn't scare Elias. Too much death during battle had taught him the price of silence. One cold morning, Margaret visited Elias's surgery. She waited until the last patient left, then stepped inside. "Doctor, they say Edward walked away with gold. But a man does not leave coins or wife behind without reason. Can you tell me honestly what happens in this town?" Elias said, "Grief weighs us down, but some losses are more than sadness. Look for proof, not rumors. Spring came with storms. Joseph Hart vanished in a night of wild rain, the river swollen and rough. In the morning, his horse stood planted at Margaret's fence, mud thick around its legs, eyes wide with confusion. The sheriff guessed Joseph was swept away by the current, but the search for his body showed nothing except deeper river twists. Margaret went to church that Sunday, psalm book gripped with white knuckles, tears streaking her cheeks. Women whispered, "How much can one woman bear?" Men watched her garden, thick with beans, squash, and dark root crops, wondering if luck or something else fed those strong plants. August brought a burning heat and a new face. Charles Dixon. He had a broken smile, loud laugh, and strong shoulders. He courted Margaret fast, married faster, then disappeared faster still. 3 weeks after the wedding, Charles was gone. Doors in Dry Creek locked before sundown. Children hurried home, refusing dares to cross Margaret's yard. Elias noticed odd things. A smile held too long, a greeting that felt rehearsed. In his journal, Elias wrote, "Margaret's eyes fill with fire, her voice smooth but hollow." When asked about Charles, she said, "Men wander, Doctor. The good Lord brings them home or leads them on." Her certainty chills the room. A turning point came one day when Timothy, just 8 years old, chased a stray chicken past Margaret's garden fence. He tripped, slicing his foot on a bone sticking out of the loose earth. His father Tom cursed the garden and started digging. He found cloth, then a rib, pale and human, buried among the squash roots. Sheriff Bannon ordered careful digging. Margaret stood with folded arms, voice steady. "This ground saw war before we built homes. Many died and lay beneath us. Soldiers were buried here long before my family came." Many nodded, quieted by her confidence. But Elias, watching from the fence, wondered what stories the soil hid below every root. That night, Elias boiled fragments retrieved from the garden. Watching how the marrow released into boiling water, he took notes in his journal. Marrow faded by fire, cuts as clean as surgeon's work. No accident, no animal. Men's hands did this. Sleep abandoned him as knowledge darkened his mind. Whispers grew. Farmers woke early but checked the paths for fresh footprints. Women drew water together, silent glances passing between cups. Mothers squeezed their children's hands at Margaret's approach. The preacher urged the town to keep faith in neighbors, repel evil thoughts. But anxieties grew like weeds in the fields. Margaret's garden grew more abundant with every passing season. Some saw fortune, others saw curse. Old Mrs. Lowell murmured, "So much blooming for so much sorrow." The garden's health seemed unnatural, its order too neat for Montana's wild soil. Elias sent a letter south, unsigned, to the marshal at Helena. 3 husbands lost. Lesson: every marriage vanishes. Please bring outside eyes to see what Dry Creek hides. Later, historians would confirm Elias was the letter's author, putting his reputation at risk for truth. By autumn, Dry Creek's neighbors split, some avoiding Margaret on the roads, others dismissing Elias as a troublemaker. Even friends shied away from the doctor's warnings. Margaret held herself together, walking straight back through town, baskets full, eyes forward. One night in late October, Margaret was seen trudging through her garden after midnight, lantern swaying, carrying a heavy bundle wrapped in thick cloth. A ranch hand named Caleb, restless with worry, watched as she laid the bundle deep into the earth, soil clinging red to her fingers. In the morning she sang in church, voice proud, and Caleb told his wife what he'd seen. His story hurried from house to house. Elias filled pages with frantic notes. The garden feeds more than roots. Her voice belongs more in a tomb than a kitchen. Winter tightened Dry Creek's fear. Dogs sniffed Margaret's fence, finding bits of shirt, bloody and torn. The sheriff bagged the scraps, pressing Margaret for answers. She repeated, "The land here holds memories, not crimes. Soldiers died long ago." Most townsfolk wanted to believe, but Elias saw the cracks. Marshall's men arrived, heavy coats damp with snow. They interviewed half the town, dug small holes, listened to Elias describe bone and marrow tests. Their report, marked confidential and numbered, MER 4E847B, concluded, Doctor credible but emotional. At least 2 male bodies found. Cuts clear, possibly tool-made. Animal activity cannot be ruled out. No arrest without further proof. Recommend monitoring subject. December brought more funerals than celebrations. Margaret tended her garden, lips pursed, steps slow. Elias spent evenings drawing maps, labeling fragments, pressing Anna to stay close. Margaret's world of sorrow seemed to grow larger while Dry Creek shrank with anxiety. Margaret's life moved in a cycle. Kindness, courtship, quick marriage, immediate loss. Elias's trunk filled with letters, soil samples, journal pages, buttons, and small personal items, each labeled, dated, cross-referenced like a historian's dream. One cold March night in 1875, after returning from a farm on the far hill, Elias found a letter outside his cabin. It read, Midnight, garden fence, the earth gives answers. Lantern in hand, Elias dug, sweat streaking his brow despite the ice. Rope appeared, then leather. A belt buckle stamped J.H. Elias dropped to his knees. Joseph Hart's initials branded proof on his shaking hands. As he stumbled away from the garden, Elias noticed another set of footprints. Margaret watched from her window, eyes deep pools, face unchanged, neither shocked nor joyful. Dry Creek's wind moaned. Elias understood the real danger was not the secrets buried under Margaret's fence, but the town's need to keep looking away. The valley waited as tragedy settled quietly in every shadow, seen by few, feared by all. People avoided Margaret through the spring. Conversations dried up when she passed. Even children stopped their games, whispering instead about the garden and the bones beneath their feet. The tension was alive. An invisible rope stretched between every cabin on the edge of the wood. Anna, Elias's daughter, watched her father more closely as he spent longer hours at his desk, charting deaths, mapping missing men, and organizing evidence. Anna asked, Father, why do you stare into the darkness? Elias would answer, because the truth is growing there faster than any beans or flowers. New faces came to town but kept distance from Margaret's home. The blacksmith fixed his tools in silence. The preacher's wife watched with worry, and the sheriff made his rounds late, boots loud enough to be warning. Spring wind whistled across fences, stealing secrets as always. One day the preacher snapped, raising his voice in church. We build walls of silence. Evil eats at those walls until none stand. But most people bowed their heads, yearning for peace over answers. Elias put his last journal entry for that month in Anna's hands. If we don't face what grows beneath, we are as lost as the men buried there. And with the coming thaw, Dry Creek's long waiting was almost over. The valley, the garden, and all the silent hearts prepared for the reckoning that would change everything. Spring crept back into Dry Creek slower than anywhere else in Montana. The wind lost its bite, and icy furrows cracked open for new plants and old secrets. Snowmelt traced shimmering paths past Margaret Walker's white fence, pooling in the dips where nobody dared dig. People whispered that the soil behind her cabin stayed softer than any other in town, that roots tangled with things far beyond beans and squash. Most homes in Dry Creek began the season with hope. Men patched roofs, children herded goats, and women traded seeds while keeping wary eyes toward Margaret's home. Her steady ritual never changed. Every morning, boots crunching on gravel, she carried bread and tea to neighbors who took them with trembling gratitude. The kindness unsettled them, as if any favor might cost dearly in return. Dr. Elias hardened further, sleep lost to the grind of dread and duty. He mapped missing men with shaky hands and a mind sharp from war and sorrow. Anna, his daughter, watched him through cracked doors, eyes tired and afraid, whispering nightly, "Father, come back from the dark." Elias traced evidence in silence: soil samples, torn shirts, fragments of bone labeled with careful dates. Sometimes he wandered past Margaret's fence, hoping for answers to float up through the thawing earth. Only more questions came. Then Henry Sims arrived, a cattle trader from Missouri with silver buckles and a loud, laughing talk. He strolled into town and set his gaze on Margaret, tipping his hat in church, helping mothers carry firewood, making himself helpful but never quite at ease. Folks muttered that new men should stay clear of Margaret and her luck, but Sims waved away warnings with a bright grin. By June, his courtship bloomed. Elias watched every moment, storm brewing behind his steady eyes. He tried reason, warning neighbors, pressing Sheriff Bannon, and even sending Anna to keep distance. The sheriff, tired of the rumors and tension, replied, "Doctor, I need more than hushed stories. Truth is heavy. Without proof, it only wounds us both." Elias pleaded anyway. Henry Sims was last seen entering Margaret's cabin at sunset on June 3rd, his horse tied neatly outside. Morning came. Sims did not. Margaret told everyone he'd gone west before dawn, chasing a bigger cattle deal. Few believed, but nobody argued. The air grew thick, the town itself holding its breath in one long, painful sigh. Elias could not let the pattern repeat. He walked the edge of Margaret's garden nightly, fingers trailing along the fence, boots leaving prints alongside hers. Then, deep in a restless midnight, he dug where the soil felt loose and strange. Lantern light danced inside a shallow hole. Out came cloth, blood. You could spell Sims's name in the torn, faded letters stitched into the vest. Rancid soil stuck to Elias's hands. He dropped the vest back in the hole, chest heaving, truth flooding him colder than any blizzard. Margaret appeared instantly, as if she'd stepped out of moonlight. Her voice gentle, words sharp. "Do you understand me now, Doctor?" she asked, eyes shining with something between triumph and sorrow. Elias, choking on dirt and dread, demanded, Why do you do this?" His voice broke with the waste and heartbreak of every missing man. Margaret came close, standing in shadow and lantern glow. "Men think marriage is ownership, their right to take and use. I learned if you want freedom, you must bury their need before it buries you. I plant what men leave behind so nothing grows over me. No man owns me now." Her voice ran cold through every bone in Elias's body. He staggered back, swearing he'd bring the marshal, bring law, bring truth to light. Margaret smiled, the smallest curve of her lips stealing all sense of safety. "Law is a net made by men. They only ever trap themselves," she said as the garden whispered. Elias's fear turned desperate. Townsfolk now argued openly. Some called for Margaret's arrest. Others claimed Elias was deranged, haunted by war ghosts and garden bones. Children whispered new rhymes. 3 men down, 1 more gone. Buried deep where roots grow strong, Pastor Gibbons led prayers for peace and wisdom, voice cracking beneath the weight of watching neighbors' hope shrivel. Elias assembled evidence, journal pages, soil samples, fragments of men's clothing, into a battered box marked for Helena Court. He planned to leave town, but fate worked against him. His wagon broke on the road. Papers scattered, some swept away by the river's pull. Many feared the marshal's men would never return, and evil would win in the slow turning of the earth. Events pushed against the silence. 2 children playing in Margaret's field as the last snows melted, unearthed a jawbone with a stick. News spread faster than the creek. That night Dry Creek gathered before dusk. Eyes and lanterns pointed at Margaret's porch. Sheriff Bannon dug deep, pulling Henry Sims's body from the ground, ruined, a wound defiling the body's secret places. No one could pretend anymore. Panic erupted. Some shouted for Margaret's immediate hanging. Others, shivering with fear and pity, pleaded for mercy. The sheriff, pale-faced, begged everyone to wait for the law. Elias stood over the body, voice raw. "This is what your silence brought. None can look away now." Margaret did not scream, did not run. She stood still, face unreadable, eyes locked on Elias as if daring him to finish the story. That night the marshal finally returned, flanked by stern deputies. The official report, sealed and stamped September 1st, 1875, laid it out. Subject apprehended without violence. Grounds reveal 3 human remains. Identical mutilation by bladed tool, precise execution. Town testimony affirms pattern tied to marriage. Animal activity discounted. Recommendation: custody and federal review. Dry Creek held its breath. Court proceedings in Helena pulled Margaret away, but still failed to answer the real questions. Records hit barrier after barrier, delayed hearings, missing papers, sealed files. Margaret disappeared from all official texts after 3 months in jail. Some whispered federal wagons moved her to Fort Benton. Others believed she escaped in the wilds. The sheriff, Elias, Anna, and every neighbor waited, dreaded, guessed. But Margaret was neither found nor buried, just gone. Years blurred by, grief mixing with the stubborn pull of everyday life. Elias, broken but burning for answers, filled journal after journal with the echoes of Margaret's crimes, the shape of her voice, the cold taste of her garden's air. He grew quiet, grew gray, his daughter Anna settling east, never speaking her father's name to strangers outside town. Elias's last record, dated December 19, 1875, simply read, "She left Helena by federal wagon." No trace returned. Every wind that smells like garden dirt brings her memory hunting me again. Anna, years later, kept only one scrap of paper in her attic. Her father's trembling words. "Silence saved me. Children kept the old rhymes alive. Dares to touch Margaret's fence. Bets to dig in the earth where beans grew fastest." Some county workers, much later in the new century, struck a trunk installing telephone poles. Inside, they found rotted cloth and a rusted blade marked M.W. Their foreman ordered the spot covered and left undisturbed, muttering, "Some ground doesn't want us here." Margaret's legacy outlived every written account. Grown men taught their sons and daughters, don't trust in neat gardens or quick marriages. At the Montana Historical Society in Helena, file Dar 4847B vanished, replaced by a note. Removed. 1902. Still in Dry Creek, the truth stayed below ground. Bones and secrets side by side. Every wind that rustled Margaret's cabin ruins carried an echo most townsfolk refused to hear. Parents whispered warnings. Preachers sang about forgiveness, but no one planted beans in the old garden anymore. Sometimes, on hot nights, the air seemed to pulse with the breath of missing men. Margaret's story lived only as fragments, half-burnt in journals, choked in runaway songs, dared in games along the fence line. In a town so small, everyone counted nights and neighbors more closely. But not all graves got counted. Because in Dry Creek, the counting ended where Margaret's garden began. Elias, last of the old truth-tellers, kept staring at stars behind his cabin until the day claimed him for good. Anna let the papers sleep. Only the valley remembered, and only the bravest ever dug for answers. And so, every man who married Margaret Walker found his grave before a wedding ended, his voice drowned out by squash roots in the silence of neighbors. Law forgot, but the dirt remembered, year after year after year.